Has anybody visited Fort Clatsop? I've already had a couple people. Yes.
All right.
All right, down by Astoria.
Wow,
All right.
good.
And this is a guy that's very, what, 11 years now?
It'll be 11 years this summer. Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, the special treat. Fort Clatsop is down by Astoria, and it's well worth the trip down there. I love Astoria itself, too, the town of Astoria, but this Fort Clatsop's only a couple miles out, and it's just a great place to visit. And living history is one of their fortes. And of course, Ranger Randy is Randy Francom. He lives up here in Lacey with his family, and then during the summer months, he goes down there and does these programs about Lewis and Clark. So in fact, that was about 3 months ago that you were here for the Tumwater Historical Association's annual meeting. And so I've had a preview of this program, and I know you're going to love it. So I'm just going to hand it right over to Ranger Randy Francom.
Thank you, Don, for that very warm welcome. I'm really happy to be here today and happy to see so many. I'm going to try to talk loud since I don't have a microphone, so if you can't hear me in the back, holler. If my voice goes down too low at some point in the program, just say louder and I'll get going. So okay right now, it sounds like. Okay, good. I'll try to maintain this volume. The Lewis and Clark expedition began, actually the whole story begins with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, although he never ventured much farther west than his Monticello home, he always had a keen interest in the West. And in fact, before he became president, he was involved in sponsoring a couple of abortive expeditions to the West. Now, he became president in 1801, and there are two big events that happened to open up the West, because he had a vision for the United States. He conceived of a United States that would extend from sea to shining sea. This at a time when people thought that was impossible or certainly impractical. How can you possibly govern such a large territory? But that was his vision for the United States. And of course, you all know about the Louisiana Purchase that happened during his administration, which added that whole midsection of the continent. But that didn't go out to the Pacific Northwest. It didn't go out to the Pacific. But his idea was that the United States would one day extend all the way to the Pacific. How do you make that happen? Well, let me give you a little background of what's going on. Now, at the time he became president, the United States did have a claim to the Pacific Northwest. It was based on the voyages and discoveries of Captain Robert Gray out of Boston. He had a ship which he sailed around the Horn on a couple of occasions, coming up the Pacific coast to trade for furs. The fur trade was the impetus behind exploration because it was so lucrative, and all the nations of the world were competing for furs. And I'm talking sea otter, seal, beaver, fox, wolf, all sorts of things. And so it was very valuable, and the nations were competing, as I said. And Gray comes up the coast. Actually, in 1790 was the first time, and he traded for a hold of furs, and then he went to China to sell them. And he was actually the first American to circumnavigate the globe. And in China, these furs were in great demand. You got really good prices from the upper classes of China. At any rate, he comes back in 1792. And he's coming up the coast. And he is looking for, among other things, he is looking for the Great River of the West. Some of you have heard of that. There had been, how should I say, a theory that there had to be some great river in the west somewhere that opens into the Pacific Ocean. And some of the maps, early maps of that day, actually depicted a big river, even though no one had ever actually seen it, depicted a big river at the west, and on some maps it was called the Oregon, or the Oregon River. And anyway, Gray's on the lookout for possibly this river. And he comes up off Cape Disappointment. And at Cape Disappointment, he sees that there's a lot of silt, a lot of currents, indicating that coming out there is a large river. Now, you can't be sure, though, unless you get inside the river. There it could be just a big bay. So he puts out a smaller boat that goes out in front of his large ship to sound the sandbars and so on and find a channel if possible. And what happened is he was able to actually get his ship inside the Columbia River bar and determine for sure that a great river was there. And he named it after his ship, the Columbia Rediviva. And the name stuck. And he, and later on, he goes back to the United States, and the government seized on his discovery to make a claim to the Pacific Northwest, and particularly the Columbia River. And so this, but the problem with it is that the claim was disputed. We're in a lot of competition. The Spanish had been up many years. They were the first ones up the coast. So the Spanish had been up the coast. The British had been up the coast. You all know about James Cook. Same year as Gray in 1792, George Vancouver was up exploring. And so there was a lot of competition for the North American fur trade. Yes?
Yeah, who would adjudicate a claim like that? I mean, was it basically whoever could have the armament?
Yeah. Sometimes. The question is, how would you decide these disputed claims? And sometimes there would be force of arms, other times there would be treaties signed, and that's a whole other story. I could get into it another time. But yeah, eventually all these claims were settled. But anyway, let me give you another interesting thing that happened. A lot of people think that Lewis and Clark were the first people of European descent to cross overland the North American continent. That's not true. It was Alexander Mackenzie, a Canadian and a British subject, who 13 years before Lewis and Clark, in 1793, crossed the continent in present-day Canada and came out at the Pacific at Bella British Columbia. And when Mackenzie gets back home, he writes a book. He called it Voyages from Montreal. And for one thing, he says in the book, I was on the upper reaches of the Columbia River. The second thing he did is he outlined his scheme for British domination of the North American fur trade. Well, a copy of that book comes to the attention of President Jefferson. He's thinking, oh my gosh, the British have been on the Columbia River. Actually, it turns out he was not on the Columbia River. He was on the Fraser, but nobody knew that. At any rate, so he's concerned. He's concerned about them getting in, dominating the fur trade before we get there. So he says, I got to get my own men out there. Now, he already had plans to send out an expedition. Now that he's president, commander-in-chief, he can send the army out there. And so he already had plans. But this Mackenzie pushes him along to hurry it up a bit. Well, who to lead it? Well, he knew just the man, Meriwether Lewis. Lewis had grown up as a neighbor to President Jefferson, had experience in the army, and Lewis knew him to have the courage, the skills, and the experience necessary to lead this expedition. So he brings Lewis into the White House to serve as the president's personal secretary for a while. And together they begin to plan the expedition. In the course of planning, Jefferson urges Lewis to find somebody to be second in command. Somebody that can take over if something happens to you. And Lewis knew just the man for that job, William Clark, a fellow Virginian, but they served together in the Army. And actually Clark was Lewis's commanding officer for a time, and they became very good friends. So, but Lewis's idea was not to have a second in command. He wanted a co-captain or co-leader of the expedition. So he wrote a letter to Clark, who was then living on the Ohio River at Clarksville, Indiana, and offered him this post to be a co-leader of this expedition with him. And Clark wrote back, I think, the same day, accepting this, and there formed one of the greatest partnerships in American history. And I'm going to talk a lot about teamwork because I believe that teamwork was one of the principal reasons for their success. And they didn't call it that. That's not a term that they used, but it's a term that we use today. And over the course of this expedition, you know, they were together about 3 years, constant stress, constant hardship. And there's no indication in the journals that they ever argued or seriously disagreed about anything of consequence. How many of you can say that about the people you live with? So they were pretty amazing in that respect. They also had two other qualities that I think were critical. One is courage, obviously. In fact, it was Jefferson that said Lewis had courage undaunted. Some of you may have read the book Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose on a biography of Lewis. And Clark was said by a contemporary to be as brave as Caesar. And they also had unbelievable determination. So determination, courage, and teamwork. Well, Jefferson's idea for the expedition was quite detailed, actually. And it wasn't just to get to the Pacific Ocean and back and maybe do some mapping. It was much more than that. He wanted, first of all, he's a scientist. He wants to know about the flora and the fauna. Anything that's new to science, you want to write it up and bring back specimens. He wanted to know about geography. He wanted to know about the climate and the weather. He wants to know about the Native Americans, tell us about their cultures and everything like that. And another important goal was to be diplomats to the Native Americans, to the Indians. Show the flag, if you will, and extend a hand of friendship, and especially to draw the natives into the American fur trade empire. They were vanguards of business, okay? And they were to locate sites for likely trading posts. They were to trade with the Indians, but show off some goods about, hey, these are the kinds of things that American traders will bring to you. Don't trade with our competitors, the British. We have better stuff, all right? So that was all part of it. Okay, now, as I mentioned, Lewis and Clark were great team members, but let us not forget that there were a lot of other members of the expedition. They recruited 29 other men and a woman, of course, who would accompany them to the Pacific Ocean. Each of these people had a specific skill set. They were drawn from all sorts of different walks of life and areas of the country, and they had roles to play, and everyone had to do his or her job well, simply to survive, and especially to cross North America and return safely. So very much a team effort. Well, they started out from St. Louis, Missouri. The idea was to take the Missouri River all the way to its source somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, cross those mountains, hopefully a short portage, maybe half a day, and to some waters of the Columbia River and float the Columbia River down to the coast. As you already know, the Columbia River was already discovered, and so they knew the longitude and latitude of the mouth of the Columbia River. It's in between they didn't know too much about. At any rate, they start out in big, heavy boats. They had a 55-foot long keel boat and two smaller plank boats, but they were still pretty hefty. They were 35, 40 feet long, and they carried somewhere between 28 and 32 tons of material. And they're getting this up the current, against the current of the Missouri River, using their own muscle power, poling, rowing, sometimes getting out towing their boats, getting hung up on sandbars, trying to avoid sawyers and logs in the water, bitten by mosquitoes every day, boiling sun. It was tough work. These men were incredibly tough. It took them basically all summer to get from St. Louis to North Dakota. It was fall. They started out in May of 1804. They get up to North Dakota in October 1804. And they know winter is approaching. And so they decide to winter. Actually, there was a sort of winter with the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes, who had a series of villages in the center part of North Dakota. And They built a fort to spend that winter. Does anyone spend a winter in North Dakota? Yes, it was cold. They had a thermometer. At one point, it got down to 40 degrees below zero that winter. But they were fairly snug in their fort, and they took the time to inquire of the Indians there about the way west. Tell us, what are the mountains going to be like when we get there? The Indians said, first of all, they're very high, and they're very wide, and you will not be able to use your boats anymore. Well, you're going to need horses if you expect to cross the mountains. Where can we get horses?
Indians.
Exactly. Is there a tribe there, they asked, that would have horses we could buy? They said yes. The Shoshone tribe is there, right near the headwaters of the Missouri. They have a lot of horses. Maybe they'll sell you some. So Lewis and Clark are thinking, it'd be nice to have somebody who spoke the language to help us negotiate for these horses. Well, it so happened living with the Mandan Indians there was a French-Canadian trader. His name was Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau approached them with the idea of going along as an interpreter, and they weren't terribly interested in him, but they found out that he had 2 Shoshone wives.
Uh-oh.
2. Well, this is great. So you're hired. You can bring one. One woman is enough on this trip. At any rate, we don't know the reason why Sacagawea was chosen instead of the other woman, because she was pregnant at the time. It actually gave birth that winter to a baby boy. But for whatever reason, she was the one chosen to go along. She wasn't very old, maybe 16 or so. How did she get from her homeland in Idaho to North Dakota? Well, she had been captured by the Hidatsa tribe when she was maybe 11, 12 years old. They had raided her tribe for girls. Girls become wives and mothers, okay? And so they captured her and some other girls and took her back to the Mandan Hidatsa. It was the Hidatsa tribe that had taken her. And she learned the Hidatsa language, and she knows, obviously, her native Shoshone, so she could be valuable as an interpreter. So they hired Charbonneau, and she comes along, and the baby. At any rate, what else, they asked the Indians, what else are we going to see when we get farther west? Well, one thing you're going to see is a big, ferocious beast. Now, what do you think that animal was? The grizzly bear, absolutely. They had never seen grizzlies before. And the Indians told them that these animals are huge. They're not like the black bears that they were familiar with. These animals, they get on their hind legs, they stand much higher than a man. They have claws longer than your fingers, long, sharp teeth, can run as fast as a horse, and are very hard to kill, the Indian said. It's not uncommon for us to lose a man or two when we go out and hunt them. The men of the expedition are thinking, ooh, this sounds exciting. We want to, they're actually anxious to see them and to test their hunting skills against them. Because they're thinking, yeah, maybe they're formidable for you. What do you have? You got bows and arrows and these very indifferent trade muskets. We have the best weaponry the United States can provide for us. Okay. This particular piece is a model 1795 Springfield musket. This was standard Army issue at the time. The men who were already in the Army, when they joined the expedition, brought these with them. Okay, it is a 69 caliber flintlock. Okay, but they are single shot. Okay, you have to reload after every shot. So let me briefly explain the loading process. It's kind of fun. First thing you have to do is load gunpowder. So you take a powder measure, usually made of brass like this. You open up your powder horn, you measure out the proper amount of gunpowder, you pour it down the muzzle of the gun. You then take your lead ball with a patch. Here's a lead ball about the right size. Stick a patch in there, put your ball in there, insert it, pull out your ramrod. Ram it all down to the bottom, nice and tight. return your ramrod to your place, to where it goes, because you don't want to leave it lying around. And then you still have to prime the weapon, which means you open up this mechanism here called the lock. You take your gunpowder, a little bit of gunpowder, and you put it in what's called the pan here. Cover it up with this piece of steel. Now I'm ready to shoot. Now, that was a quickie version that could take up to a minute. Okay. Well, let's get back to the grizzly bears. They get out, when spring came, they get back on the rivers, and they're headed west, and they get into the Great Plains of Montana. They start encountering grizzlies, and of course they go out to hunt them. And they find when you hunt grizzlies, you'd better bring along a lot of your friends. Because as I said, you have only one shot with these, and they found they could not kill grizzlies with a single shot. How do you suppose a grizzly reacts if you shoot it, but don't kill it? They are rather angry, and they come after you. You're no longer the hunter, you are the hunted. And they're coming after you. So you better have some buddies. What they found was they were being chased up trees, into rivers, and everything, trying to escape these animals. So let me tell you a story about a grizzly bear hunt. One day, they'd already seen a lot of these bears already, but one day they're on the river and they're paddling along. They look off to the side and they see a huge grizzly, maybe the biggest they had seen so far, about 300 yards off the river. So 6 of the men got together to form a hunting team. And they made a plan. Their plan was that they would creep up behind the grizzly, trying to stay out of sight. Trying to stay upwind from the grizzly so it doesn't blow, the wind doesn't blow your scent to them, because they have keen senses of smell. They will smell you coming before they see you. And when they got within range, their plan was that 4 of the 6 would fire their guns at the same time. They thought that should be sufficient. But just in case it wasn't, they still had 2 men in reserve. So that is what they did. They crept up behind the grizzly bear. They got up on a little rise, looking down upon it, now about 40 paces away. And the bear had not noticed them as yet. So as planned, 4 of the 6 aimed their guns at the bear and fired at about the same time. Boom, 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 boom. They struck the bear. Do you think they killed it? No. It rose up and it was mad. Rah! Starts charging right at them. So the other 2 men, they just charged their guns as well. Boom, boom. One of those shots actually broke the bear's shoulder, but it kept coming. Ah! The men scattered all over the countryside, running for their lives. Now, what do you suppose is faster, the grizzly or the man? Yeah, absolutely. It chased 2 of the men all the way to their canoes. They jumped in to paddle away. By that time, 2 of the others, though, had reloaded their guns. They took aim at the bear as well, and they fired. Boom, boom. They also struck the bear. But as they said in the journals, all that served to do was direct the bear to them. Rah! The bear is chasing them, catching up with them, chased them all the way to a cliff. Whoa, it's 20 feet straight down the river. Look behind them, here comes the bear. So what'd they do? They jumped. Here comes the grizzly. What did it do when it come to the edge, do you think? Yeah, it pitched headlong into the river, thrashing about, almost getting those men. But fortunately for them, one of the others had been hiding in the bushes. He managed to reload his gun. He came up to the edge, took very careful aim at the grizzly's head. Kaboom! Finally killing it. Phew. I get winded just telling that story. Anyway, they hauled the carcass out of the water, counted the shots that hit it. Anybody count the shots? 9. 8 struck the bear. As I said, broke the shoulder, passed through the lungs. This animal had kept coming. Very fierce animal indeed. And if these men had not worked together, certainly 1 or more of them would have fallen victim to that very fierce animal. As it was still very close. Well, they proceeded on. And in fact, if you ever read the journals, the phrase you would see the most is "we proceeded on." Almost every day, and to me that exemplifies their sheer determination of to go day after day, not knowing what was around the next bend of the river. No matter what the obstacle was, they're going to make it. And so you'll see that a lot in the journals if you read them. They were stuck for about a month portaging the Great Falls in Montana. And they finally, late in August of 1805 now, they are approaching the Rocky Mountains. They see these mountains. They're higher than any mountains they could ever imagine. Anything they'd seen. They were hoping for something like the Appalachians. It's just not that way, you know. And they're covered in snow even in late summer, some of the peaks. And so they're worried. And it takes a while, but Lewis is finally able to locate the Shoshones. And now it's time to try to see if we can get some horses. And for this part of my program, I would love to have some volunteers. I would love to have about 5 of you, if you would, to help me go about how they went about trading for these horses. And let me tell you what you'll be doing. Okay. First of all, you get to be one of those people. And I have some clothing items we can try to put on. These are actually, I do school programs and around here, and these are kind of cut for kids, so if adults, you might have to just kind of hold them. At any rate. So I'm needing 5 volunteers if possible. I see 2 kids back there. Which of you would like to be Meriwether Lewis? Doesn't matter which one. How about the girls? Fine. Come on. Okay, maybe come on up, both of you. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay, why don't you be Lewis? Okay. And I bet you can fit into this. So let's go ahead, put your head and arms in there and put that on this buckskin. I have a part for you in just a minute, okay? All right. Okay, very good. Okay. Turn around, show everybody. Okay, you get to wear a hat too. Here you go. All right. Here we have Meriwether Lewis.
You look like the little kid of the...
Okay, would you like to be... Okay, are you brother and sister? Okay. I would like you to be Sacagawea in a minute. Okay, we're going to wait for that. But before I do that, I need somebody else who could come up and be Kamehameha, chief of the Shoshones. Who would... There's got to be actors in this room. Okay. All right. Somebody, anybody, come on up. What? You can't point to other people. You can only volunteer. Okay. All right, what's your name, sir?
Rusty.
Rusty, great. Turn around, I'm going to put you in a blanket. Okay, here we have Kamehameha, chief of the Shoshones. Now, whenever they meet a new chief, they would present him with gifts. One of those gifts was typically a Jefferson Peace Medal.
Oh, cool.
It's got an image of President Jefferson on this side. It's got handshaking on the other side. This was presented as gifts. It's
Do I get to keep that?
Well, for a few minutes. Okay, Lois, would you present this, please, to Kamehameha? I've never seen that before.
I thought he might propose.
Okay, you can put, yeah, you can if you want.
All right.
Put that over your neck. Okay, now, were you two able, do you think able to actually talk to one another and be understood?
Only with her.
Yeah, so you speak only English, you speak the Shoshone language. That's why they brought Sacagawea, all right? Now, so I have a small dress I think will fit you.
Ooh.
So you get to wear this.
Is that a wolf fur?
Nope, it's not.
No, it's not.
Oh, that's a coyote.
Oh.
Here you go. Okay, so you go here. All right.
How do I?
Okay, here you go. All right, put your arms in there and come stand about where I am between these two gentlemen. Now, Sacagawea knew 2 languages. I think I've already covered it. She knew Shoshone, of course, from her birth, and she knew the Hidatsa language. Now he doesn't know either one of those languages. She doesn't know English, okay? She does not know English. So we need her husband, Charbonneau. Can I get somebody to be Charbonneau?
You have to speak French.
Well, we'll fake it. It'd be nice to speak French, but that's not. Can I get somebody to be Charbonneau? What?
brother can.
Your mother.
My brother.
You, come on up.
My brother.
Oh, your brother.
Your brother.
Okay, how old's your brother?
He's 7.
Okay, that's all right. Okay,
related to
you
Charbonneau.
are you really? Very good. How about a French hat for you? I'm going to stand off to the side.
He wasn't a nice person though, so.
Well, there's some debate on that. But at any rate, okay. Now, before I get too far along, here's something that really happened. Sacagawea had been away from her homeland for a long time. Actually, Lewis was the first to meet Kamehameha. She comes up later with the main party and Clark some days later. They bring her in to interpret, and people had changed a little bit since she'd been gone, but she looks at Kamehameha over here and suddenly realizes that he is her brother. Oh, she is so happy to see him that she broke down. She began to weep. She threw arms around him and hugged him. All of that, it's quite a touching scene. Yeah. So it's quite amazing that, they could have, there are a number of Shoshone bands. They could have run into any number of them, but they were so fortunate that they ran into her exact band and her brother in the meantime to become the chief. Wow, talk about fortunate. Okay. Any rate, Charbonneau, we'll return back to you. You knew 2 languages too. Of course, being French Canadian, you know French. He knows the Hidatsa language. He's been living in the same village. He does, his English is very poor. Your French is no good. So, and what I'd like you to do is, you 2 trade places, if you would. You go down there by your brother. Okay, and we need one other interpreter here. We need one of the men. He was a French-American. His name was Francois Labiche. Labiche knew French and English. Okay, can I get one more individual, please? Come on up. Okay. You get to wear a nice shirt like I have here. Okay, if you can, I think it's big enough. Let's turn it around. There you go.
Okay.
All right. And Labiche was a private in the Army, and this was one of the soldiers' hats of the day. There's another soldier's hat of the day. So you put that down, and if you could, I'm not sure it'll fit, but you can try that on. There you go. Very nice. Okay, I'd like you to stand between these 2 individuals. Okay, here's what had to happen. To be able to communicate, somebody asked me earlier about communication. Here's what they had to do. Lewis would speak in English to Kamehameha. It would be translated into French by Labiche for Charbonneau. Charbonneau would translate it into Hidatsa for Sacagawea. She would translate it another time into Shoshone for Kamehameha. When he responded, it'd go back the other way. Now think how hard that would be.
The message might get goofed up.
Exactly. But it was very important these people do their job well. You cannot have confusion. You would get possibly anger. There'd possibly, confusion, as you said. And they would not get the horses they desperately had to have. If they don't get horses, their expedition ends then and there. And we wouldn't be talking about them today. Okay? So these people have to do their job well. So we're going to see how they do. Okay. Now, have you all played telephone?
Yes.
Okay. Then you know how it works. I am going to whisper something in your ear like Lewis may have said. So I'll give you something to say. You whisper to Labiche here, and we're going to go down the line until it gets Kamehameha. When it gets to you, tell the audience what it sounded like. Okay, are you ready? Okay, here we go. We need horses to cross the mountains.
We need horses to cross the mountain.
Very good. Now, one thing I need to do is keep the sentences short, because if you have long sentences, it's going to be more confusing. So we're going to keep this short. But I'm going to ask you, Kamehameha, you have horses, but otherwise your people are poor. Okay? So you think you're just going to give them away? No, you're going to say something like this. What do you have to grade?
I think so.
Okay, tell us.
What do you need?
Uh-oh. What did we start out with?
What do you have to trade?
What do you have to trade?
No, it switched like in between.
All right. Well, they brought trade goods. They brought trade goods. I haven't shown you any of them, but there's a number of trade goods that they brought that I have on the table, but other things besides. So you guys get the hang of this. So I'm going to give you a list. Let's see how well you can remember a list. Here we go. We have knives, beads, fish hooks, and cloth. Got it?
Okay.
Okay. Whatever you remember, go.
I think there's one missing.
You lost one. That's okay. Okay. What is it?
We have knives,
Yes.
beets, and fish.
I said speed.
Not beads. It was beads. 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 Beads.
Peas.
B-E-A-D. Beads.
Beads.
Beads. Okay. Wait, see how hard this was. Well, to make it easier, they actually took the trade goods and they spread it out in front of Kamehameha. And they brought a lot of trade goods, things like knives, beads, fish hooks, anything made of metal, glass, like the beads, or magnifying glasses, mirrors, tools of all kinds, cloth, blankets, and so on. They spread out what they were willing to trade. And they started negotiating for horses. They got some, but they wanted a lot of horses. They had 33 people on this trip at this point, and they wanted at least one horse per person and some spares. That would seriously deplete your herd.
Okay.
He's thinking, these men have something else that they haven't offered to me yet. And so he says something like this. We want guns for the last horses.
We want guns for the horses.
Yes, for those last few horses, the price goes up. They want guns. They don't have very many. They don't have access to guns like their enemies, the Hidatsas, who had taken Sacagawea away, like the Blackfeet and others of their enemies.
Where did they get them?
They got them mostly from Canada, from Canadian traders.
Really?
Yes. And so they had access to guns and ammunition. The Shoshone, not so much, because they're distant. They're a much smaller tribe. They're weak. And so now Lewis, and Clark, they're not that interested in trading their guns. At this point in the expedition, they have a long ways to go, but they desperately need the horses. And so actually Kamehameha makes a very good argument. He says, look, we either need our horses to run away from our enemies, or we need guns to defend ourselves from our enemies. Logical argument. So they traded some guns and ammunition for the last of the horses they would need. Now, they didn't trade their best guns. They kept those for themselves, but it was a fair trade. The Shoshone did not trade their best horses either. Okay, so, but these folks here, working so well together, were successful in helping them get the horses they would need. So I would like to give them a cheer like they would cheer back then. They would shout, huzzah. That was, so let's do it 3 times. Hip, hip, huzzah! Hip, hip, huzzah! Hip, hip, huzzah! Thank you very much. And I'll go ahead and...
That was the Lewis and Clark's shout. Right?
Yes, yes. Not the Indians.
I want the coyote fur.
You want the coyote fur. Sorry about that.
Thanks, sister.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just throw it over here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, it might be easier just to kind of go off like this. There you go. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. They loaded up the horses and proceeded on, entered into the mountains. And I don't know if anybody's been across Lolo Pass. on the Idaho-Montana border. It's very rugged. And they did hire a Shoshone guide, but it began to snow, and their guide got lost because it looks different, you know. And it got so bad they couldn't find game to hunt, very little game in those mountains. They started eating a few things they really were hoping not to eat. One of them is this material, which is soup. It's called a portable soup. It's kind of like a bouillon. Doesn't satisfy the man. They're used to being red meat eaters, these men are. They butchered at least 2 colts and ate those. So it was very difficult through the snow. I don't know if you've ever been in buckskins in snow. Soaks right through your moccasins, and so they were miserable. They ended up traveling about 100 miles, finally broke out of the mountains into what's now north central Idaho, into the Nez Perce Indian area tribe. The Nez Perce did befriend them, helped them with some of their own food like salmon, camas root, which I have some samples of up here, and unfortunately for them it made them sick. Probably had some strange bacteria in all of this. Anyway, they were sick for quite a long time, but then they finally, their systems got used to it, and they built some new boats. They left the horses in the care of the Nez Perce, who agreed to keep them for their return trip. So the Nez Perce helped them build dugout canoes, and they start on the Clearwater, and then the Snake River, now entering what would become our home state of Washington, and then the Columbia River. They go down the Columbia River Gorge, which back then was full of waterfalls and rapids. It was very difficult, very hazardous, but they finally arrive on the coast in November of 1805, and right in the middle of a Northwest coast winter. Rained continually. They were pinned down on the Washington side of the Columbia River near the mouth for days on end. There's a place there, if you go there now, it's a rest area, but it's called Dismal Niche. It was a tiny little alcove in the cliffs that Clark called the Dismal Niche. They were there for 6 days, very little food, being hammered by the waves and the rain, and it was miserable, and their clothing was literally rotting off their backs. It was awful. They finally decided to cross the river to the Oregon side, now Oregon side, because it was more sheltered and there was more readily available food in the form of elk. And so they built Fort Clatsop. I was glad to see a lot of you have been there, and I certainly invite all of you, if you haven't, it's well worth the visit. I'm a National Park Ranger at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. I dress like I am today, often in the fort, and answering visitor questions and doing scheduled interpretive programs. So
That's on the Oregon side?
That's on the Oregon side, just a few miles west of Astoria.
Oh, okay.
There are plenty of signs to take you there.
Have they built a replacement?
There is, yes. You're talking about the fire a few years ago?
Well, there was one that was built to the Swedish
Yes.
style. And
Finish,
I read
yes.
that not too long ago that they were replacing that with a more authentic.
Yes, that is true. Yes, to answer your question, you asked about the fort itself. The fort, in 1955, there was a replica built of Fort Clatsop. It was based on a little sketch of Clark's in his journals, but it was built more in a Finnish style as opposed to an American style. Anyway, it accidentally burnt down in the fall of 2005. And so the next year, a new replica was built, a little more authentic looking, and that's there right now. So you can come and see me. It'd be great to see you. I probably won't remember your face, but if you do happen to come this summer, I work from the end of June to Labor Day. Please, just come up and introduce yourself again to me. So that'd be great if you can come. Great place to spend, half a day or so. We got some nice films, exhibits, and other things.
And I'm sorry, I'm very curious.
Yes.
Okay, when they built a fort, was the fort primarily for defense?
It was primarily for shelter.
Or was it just it was shelter?
Yeah, they did some things to make it defensive, certainly.
Yeah.
They weren't terribly worried about attack. The natives in the area, the Clatsop tribe in the area, that's where they got the name.
So when they built the one up there where the Mandan were, again, that was mainly for shelter?
Mainly for shelter, but also defense, because you never know.
Yeah.
The Fort Mandan is much larger. The fort most people are surprised about how small Fort Clatsop is to house 33 people, in a very small quarters, probably smaller than many of your homes. you know. But at any rate, but please come. I think it's worth your while, because you're all history buffs, so you wouldn't be here. Okay, at any rate, they spent just a miserable winter. It rained all but 12 of the 12 days of the 3.5 months they were there. All they had to eat many days was elk, and more elk. I personally like elk, but not that much. Okay, so it was a very boring diet. There's a lot of illnesses and different things. But anyway, spring came finally. March of 1806, they leave. They're glad to get out of Dodge, so to speak, and they start heading back up the Columbia River. They get to the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce indeed were true to their promise and had the horses. They rounded up the horses and they were able to go back over the mountains, but again in snow, because snow takes a long time to melt out of there. So they crossed the mountains over 100 miles in the snow twice. Okay. They get on to the other side into Montana, and now it's the home stretch. And by this time, the men are working very well together. They don't need to be ordered about. They're really a good team.
Have they lost anybody?
Well, let me answer that question real quick. Let me finish one more story, and then we should have some time at the end for questions. The question was, did they lose anybody on the trip? They lost one man. Only 2 months in or so, they lost one of the sergeants. His name was Charles Floyd. He died of extreme pain in his lower right abdomen. We believe it was appendicitis. Burst appendix, which they couldn't have saved him no matter what. Best doctors of the day could not have saved him. So they didn't lose anybody else. There were plenty of accidents and illnesses, but everybody else survived the expedition, which is an amazing fact by itself. Anyway, going back to Montana. Okay, they're headed east. They get into Montana. Lewis and Clark split up. They both wanted to explore some new country on the way home. They made these plans at Fort Clatsop that when they get there, they're going to split up. Clark's going to take a more southerly route, end up on the Yellowstone River. Not Yellowstone Park, but the Yellowstone River that flows out of Yellowstone Park. And Lewis was going to go up follow the Missouri down. And they're exploring this new country, and the Yellowstone and the Missouri come together near the North Dakota-Montana border. They'd pass it on the way up. They're going to meet there. Okay, so anyway, so some of the men are with Clark, some of the men are with Lewis. One of the men that was with Lewis, his name was Pierre Cruzat, another French-American. He knew languages. He could help with interpretation from time to time. He also was a boatman. In fact, he was probably their best boatman. He was recruited for that very reason. And you need that skill, obviously, if you're on the rivers most of the time. He also had another talent everybody appreciated. He was a musician. He played the fiddle. And many a night around the campfire, he would play it for the enjoyment of the men. They would dance and sing, and their spirits would be raised. Now, some of you maybe, there are other instruments along. They had tambourines, flutes, and this. Yeah, Jew's harp. Most of you know it as a Jew's harp. Today, people are going to more often call it a mouth harp. I'm not the best player in the world, but basically you put it against your teeth and you pluck this thing. So anyway, Jew's harps. Anyway, Cruzat, great man. He was a good boatman. He was an interpreter. He was a fiddle player. He raised everybody's spirits. But he had one great weakness. He was blind in one eye. May have worn a patch. In his other eye, he was nearsighted. As I said, he's with Lewis. And one day, they're going along down the river. They look out ahead and they see, a herd of elk in a willow thicket. Needing food, they pulled their boat over, and Cruzat and Lewis took their guns to go hunt these elk, leaving the other men at the boat. They go out a ways, and Lewis spies an elk. Kaboom! He killed it. Cruzat too. Kaboom! He got his. But they wanted more. So they reloaded their single-shot guns to continue hunting, with Cruzat going one way, and he soon disappeared into the willows. Lewis goes the other way. He sees an elk out there. He raised his rifle, but before he could pull the trigger, there was a shot from behind him. Kaboom! Ah, he goes down. Ah! Ah, he's shot in the rear end. Cruzat, damn you, you've shot me. Ah! But he gets no response. So he yells again, Cruzat! Still no response. He sees no movement out there in the woods whatsoever. Cruzat! Now he's thinking, maybe it wasn't Cruzat who shot me. Maybe it was Indians. They could have gotten Cruzat. I need to get back to the boat for the rest of the men. He's hurting, but he manages to get back to the boat, and when he gets there, he yells, to arms, to arms. I have been shot. Perhaps by Indians. They could have captured Cruzat. The men quickly grab their arms, their guns. He says, follow me. And they follow him. Ah! Not too far. Because, after all, he'd been shot in the butt. So he goes, he says, I'll go back to the boat, wait there. You go on without me. So he does. He gets to the boat, and he's got the gun still loaded, but having only one shot, he decided also to load his pistol and air rifle. And he wrote later in his journal, I was prepared to sell my life as dearly as possible. And he waited and waited, no doubt bleeding, in great pain. Doesn't know what's going to happen next, so there's a lot of anxiety. He doesn't hear any gunfire. He doesn't know where the men are. Can't even see them. But finally, after a long wait, he sees the men returning. And they have Cruzat with them. And by this time, of course, they have told Cruzat that the captain has been shot. Now, if you're Cruzat, you got to be thinking something like, oh no, in his French accent, have I really shot the boss? What am I going to say to him? The men come up to Lewis, they tell him, we didn't see any Indians, or even any sign of Indians. Cruzat comes up, oh, Monsieur le Capitaine, it could not have been me who shot you. I was shooting at an elk. Lewis replies, didn't you hear me? I yelled several times. No, I did not hear anything. Really? Think he was telling the truth? No, me either. I think he was scared, having shot his commanding officer. Well, it's time to check out Lewis's wounds, see how bad they were. Having been shot in the backside, of course, they had to remove his trousers. They found that the lead ball had struck him in the upper left thigh. Continued cutting across both cheeks of his backside. And exited from the right buttock. Yeah, Ooh was right. A painful wound to be sure. But he was fortunate it didn't hit any artery, bone, any vital organs. And they recovered the spent ball, which had been caught in his leather pants. They pulled that ball out and examined it, and they said, oh, that's about a .54 caliber ball. Turning to Cruzat. What gun was he using? Sure enough, same size. Not a gun an Indian would be likely to have, so they knew that he had shot Captain Lewis accidentally. Well, they linked up with Clark the very next day. Clark became Lewis's doctor, trying to keep infection out, keep it clean and so on, bandaged. And Clark wrote down in his journal what they told him had happened. He said they were out hunting elk, and they were dressed in, what do you folks think? Elk skins, to be exact. Yeah, exactly. Didn't have today's hunter orange. And what was the mistake these two men made when they were out together? They separated, yes. They split up. They could not see one another. They could not communicate in any way. They forgot the first rule of hunting, which is to always know where your companions are. In this situation, which was unusual for this trip, teamwork broke down. And it could have cost Lewis his life. But fortunately, it did not. He did recover. It took about 3 weeks to fully recover. All this time they're traveling, so it was a miserable time for Meriwether Lewis. You're not sitting in the boat anymore. You're laying on your stomach, which is not very comfortable. Anyway, it was a miserable time for him. But what about Cruzat? What do you think happened to him? Do you think they punished him for this? Most of you say no. How do we find out? The journals, exactly. Here's what Clark had to say, and I quote him. He said, this Cruzat is nearsighted and has the use of but one eye. He is an attentive, industrious man, and one whom we have both placed the greatest confidence in during the whole route. So they did indeed forgive him for this unfortunate incident. On the other hand, I have searched the journals, and I find no record they ever let him go hunting again. Okay, well, about 6 weeks after this incident, they get back to St. Louis. And that's much faster going downstream than it was. Where they might be lucky to make 10 miles coming upstream in a day, they're doing 50, 60, 70 miles a day going down. And they're anxious to get there. They get to St. Louis, and people, they've been gone so long, it was about 2 years and 4 months, people assumed they'd perished. But they survived, and they became national heroes. To me, they are still national heroes. They brought back these journals. They brought back all the specimens, all the information, all the wonderful maps. And they did it despite all the incredible hardships. It's hard for us to conceive of them today, in our modern day, how hard that was. And they were special even for their day, to be able to endure that and get through this with minimal loss of life. But I'd like to briefly talk about their legacy. Even though they are not part of our local history per se, they are a very critical part, I believe, of the history of the Pacific Northwest. If they had not come and did what they did when they did, we don't know. Maybe one of those other claims, maybe this would be Canada, this little corner of the continent where we live. We don't know that, but it could have been, you know. So they did that. They brought back those journals, as I said. That you can read them today. I hope you do if you have an opportunity. You can see it. You can find them online. Their language you kind of have to get used to a little bit, but you can see through their eyes the land like they saw it. You can feel their feelings, you know, their exhilaration, their anxiety, and all those things that happened during the trip. So part of their legacy is those journals. The maps of Clark, his map making was incredibly accurate. It was used for decades. What else can I say? Oh yeah, Jefferson's mission. He wants to know about plants and animals. They were the first to describe 300 animals and plants for science in a scientific way. And many pelts and horns and things were brought back for the scientists to study. Some of those animals were the grizzly bear, as I said, the coyote, the bighorn sheep, the pronghorn antelope. And here on the Pacific coast, they saw California condors. Okay, so marvelous things that they did to bring back that information to the United States. They started thousands of Americans on the way west. You know, they were the first. And so their legacy continues today. And part of their legacy, I think, is the example they set for all of us of what can be achieved and endured through courage, determination, and, of course, teamwork. So I thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to be here today.